And welcome to our lecture on Notes 3A. Today we'll be discussing Baptists and Congregationalists. As we have been in another video lecture series, instead of focusing on details regarding the history of these types of Christianity, instead we will focus on their theology and practices, and we'll see how they're similar and different from other types of Protestantism that we've encountered this quarter. So, as discussed in lesson 2, we have to begin. We'll go back to lesson 2 and we discuss the Puritans. And if you remember, the Puritans were in England, and they believed that the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was too Catholic. If you remember, the Anglican Church kept a lot of the Catholic vibe in terms of its church hierarchy with bishops and archbishops, and in terms of its church art and architecture and worship style with the Mass. They did change things to England. They did have the key Protestant themes of sola scriptura and sola gratis fide, but it definitely had a more Catholic worship vibe to it. And so the Puritans, they wanted to purify the Anglican Church and make it based solely on the Bible, as in the Reformed Presbyterian churches were. So again, we talked about Zwingli versus Luther. For Luther, and the Anglican and the Lutherans and the Anglican Church, you can keep things, but change them as needed to make them biblical. For the Reformed Presbyterian groups and the various radical groups like the Anabaptists, for these groups, if something wasn't in the Bible, you got to get rid of it. So again, they wanted to get rid of the organs, get rid of the stained glass windows, get rid of what they viewed as the church being too hierarchical with the bishops and archbishops. They wanted to get rid of all the liturgy and just stick to the Psalms, etc. So they wanted to it was too Catholic and needed to be changed. So for the Puritans, the Anglican Church needed more reforms. They needed to be more reformed in the Reformation. And so they were called the Puritans because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church to make it solely based on the Bible, like the Reformed Presbyterian churches. So picture these Puritans as Reformed Presbyterians. So instead of calling them Puritans, let's call them Reformed Presbyterians stuck in England with a church that they want to change, but are not being successful. So these Reformed Presbyterian Puritans, they go to Holland to escape Anglicanism, and they become influenced there by the Anabaptists, the Brethren. And they also encounter the theology of Arminius. If you recall from last lesson, we talked about the Arminian view that people have free will and that God predestines us based on our choice, not based on His choice of who will be saved. So again, Arminius is the free will guy. And the Anabaptists are the group we talked about in lesson 1 that were part of the Radical Reformation and had a more strict view of separation of church and state. They also did not believe in infant baptism. And so when you think about the Baptists, this is their 3 kinds of stems that they grow from. They grow from the Reformed Presbyterian theology, But some are more of a free will type. They also are, of course, that's why they're called Baptists. They believe in believer's baptism, not infant baptism. And it's from when these people return to England, they become known as the Baptists, and some of them as Congregationalists. And we'll see that these groups have a lot in common and are mostly different in terms of their view of baptism. So again, their three influences are Reformed Presbyterian theology, and some of them switched over to a free will view of salvation. Others do not. And the Baptists switch over to the Anabaptist view of believer's baptism, but the Congregationalists do not. So let's now talk about their views in the terms of these different categories we've been studying. First, we have church art, architecture, traditions, and music. Again, like the Reformed Presbyterians and the Anabaptists, the Congregationalists and Baptists do away with and get rid of. They get rid of any liturgy traditions that are not in the Bible, and they also get rid of, or you can say remove, all instruments, decorations in the church so as to focus on God's word and preaching. Now, Baptists and Congregationalists soon become looser in terms of their view of music, but their churches still tend to be plain and focus on preaching. So you get the longer sermons rather than lots of liturgy. Here are some images this is an image of a Baptist church. Again, notice the white walls, the clear windows. The only image you see is the cross, and you do have these PowerPoint screens up here. In the back here behind these chairs is likely the baptismal where they baptize. If you've ever been to Barrington Baptist Church, which I imagine you have, you've been to chapel on the first day of school, or some of our other concerts and events, you have the same kind of setup, very plain in terms of color, very little imagery, and in the back there you have the baptismal, kind of like a giant hot tub used to baptize believers. In this next window we see a congregational church, and although this one has a little bit fancier pillars and things like that, it's still very plain. You have a lot of white. And here, notice in this corner, that is the baptismal font for infants, because Congregationalists will differ from Baptists in terms of their view of baptism. So Congregationalists, like Reformed and Presbyterian Christians and churches, they baptize infants, versus Baptists, like Brethren churches, only baptize believers. Notice in both churches the pulpit is center and a main focus, so that you can focus on the preaching of God's word. And notice here again in this one, there's the pulpit's a little white square. It's a little hard to see, but again, it's front and center. That's what you come to church to hear, a sermon and to worship with song. It's not about liturgy, not about communion. Notice the communion table's under the pulpit because, as we'll see, it's more symbolic. It is symbolic. It's not any kind of supernatural thing. And this church doesn't even seem to have a communion table present. So let's return to the notes now. And so one thing to see is that for Congregationalists and Baptists, church is about God's word, about preaching, and decorations are at best a distraction and at worst idolatry. Concerning predestination, some Baptists and Congregationalists were Calvinists. Again, the Calvinist means predestination. But some are Arminian, meaning that they believe that we have ultimate free will and that God's predestination is based on him knowing what choice we'll make. But he doesn't entice us or force us to. So this is different, again, unlike other types of Christianity we've seen where everybody's Calvinist or everybody's Arminian. For the Baptist and Congregationalists, you'll meet different pastors in different churches will be one or the other. I even have seen some churches called Free Will Baptists, meaning that they want to identify as a church that is Arminian. In terms of communion, both Baptists and Congregationalists believe in Zwingli's memorial view. So memorialism, meaning that it is just symbolic. There's nothing supernatural going on at communion. And if you've been taught that communion is just to remember Jesus dying for us, and you've never heard that there's something special or supernatural going on, miraculous going on, then you have probably been influenced by churches that come from either the Brethren, the Baptist, or the Congregationalist backgrounds. Again, for baptism, this is the dividing point between Baptists and Congregationalists. Congregationalists, they stuck with the Reformed Presbyterian view that you do infant baptism. So infants of believers, it's the new circumcision. Sorry, that was the wrong link. The baptism was not not a salvific, meaning you don't do it to save you. It doesn't actually give you grace. It's non-sacramental. But rather a ritual to initiate children of believers into God's people. So again, you baptize babies as an initiation into the family of God until they're able to make their own decision. For Baptists, they switched over to the Anabaptist view that baptism is only really baptism if the person is old enough to believe. So it's only legitimate if done with to those with personal faith. Which is why they're called Baptists, because of their unique view of baptism. And I shouldn't say it's unique, but it was different. Again, in America, many churches practice believers' baptism, but in Europe, and especially at the time of the Reformation, that was not the case. And that was seen as a radical and bold move. In terms of church government, both Congregationalists and Baptists affirm the Anabaptist view of congregational government. And so this is why Congregationalists are called Congregationalists, because they practice congregational church government. And again, that means that each congregation is independent. So this is the kind of background of a non-denominational church. If your church is non-denominational, then you come either from Congregational or Baptist or Brethren churches, and you can tell more about, depending on your church's view of baptism and church and state. So each church is independent, and all members of the church vote for important decisions. Lastly, then, in terms of the key theological ideas, The Congregationalists, again, they're a little closer to the Reformed Presbyterians, and that, like the Puritans, they wanted to say that there's separation of church and state, but the two were closely together. So they're not the same, but they work closely together. Baptists, on the other hand, were are closer to, but not as extreme as the Anabaptist Brethren churches. So for Baptists, the ideal is that there's complete separation of church and state. However, for Baptists, and again, this is how you can tell which church, if you have practiced believers' baptism, you're closer to. For baptism, it's complete separation from church and state, but Christians can still be involved in the state. Versus, again, if you remember, for the Brethren, they were more apt to say that Christians should not run for government office or seek to serve in the military or something else. So it's completely separate, but okay for individuals to associate with. So again, the church should be separate, but the individuals can be connected. Sorry, it's messy. Church should be separate. Individuals can participate. In England, these two branches became known as the Separatists because they wanted more separation of church and state, versus the Puritans, who wanted to actually transition the Anglican Church to Reformed Presbyterian. Separatists. In time, Baptist and Congregationalist groups emerged in other countries too. However, Congregationalist churches in mainland Europe were typically referred to as evangelical free. So just as we saw that in mainland Europe, Reformed churches are called Reformed, but in Scotland and England they're called Presbyterian. So the same difference happens with Congregational churches. Evangelical here means Protestant, because that's also a different term. Evangelical because they were gospel-based, or Protestant. And free because they wanted freedom from the state. Again, they believed in separation of church and state, and they wanted freedom from this dominant church in that country. So they didn't want, if they're in Germany, Northern Germany, they didn't want to be Lutheran. They wanted to be able to have their own church. If they were in the Netherlands, they didn't want to be Presbyterian Reformed. They wanted to have their own independent churches. It's important to note that these churches were always in small numbers compared to the dominant type of Christianity. So they were a small number of English, a small number of Germans, a small number of Scandinavians or Dutch or Swiss or whatever else. And again, they were often persecuted to various degrees. Not so much violently because their views were not as extreme, but they sometimes would have a harder time operating and running their churches and could experience other kinds of discrimination. So many of them, in time, also flee to America in order to have freedom of religion, religious freedom. And that concludes our notes on Lesson 3A.